Shut your mouth, General. You don't belong in that courtroom. You think that uniform gives you respect? I'll show you what happens when someone like you talks back. Don't forget your place, or you'll regret stepping up. Before we start the story, tell me, where are you watching from? And if these stories speak to you, make sure to hit that subscribe button. The courtroom was tense, a thick, almost tangible air of anticipation pressing down on everyone present. Spectators had barely settled into their seats when Officer Ryan Mercer's presence became impossible to ignore. He sauntered in with an air of arrogance, dark navy uniform crisp and polished, badge gleaming under the harsh courtroom lights. His eyes immediately locked on to General Elizabeth Clark, a black Army general in her late 40s, her decorated uniform pristine, Star of Valor pinned proudly on her chest. The contrast between them couldn't have been starker. She stood composed, disciplined, exuding the quiet power of someone who had dedicated her life to service. He, on the other hand, radiated aggression, as if his badge gave him the right to humiliate anyone in his path. As the judge called the session to order, Mercer didn't wait. He stepped directly into Clark's personal space, leaning over the bench, voice loud enough for the courtroom to hear, dripping with disdain. "Shut your mouth, General. You don't belong in this room," he spat, his tone mocking. "You think that uniform makes you one of them? Step aside before I show you what happens when someone like you talks back." His words echoed through the courtroom, sending a ripple of shock across the spectators. Some clutching their programs, others freezing mid-breath. Clark's hands remained steady on her notes, but her eyes narrowed, a controlled fury burning behind them. She had faced combat zones, life-threatening missions, and hostile confrontations. But this was different. This was the sanctity of justice itself being violated by someone abusing their authority purely because of her skin. Her daughter, who was seated in the gallery with her, shifted slightly, sensing the palpable tension, gripping her mother's hand tightly. Clark inhaled slowly, keeping her voice calm yet cutting when she finally responded. "Your behavior is noted. Mercer, do not let your bias dictate your actions." Mercer, unbothered by the verbal warning, smirked and leaned even closer, the smirk widening as he raised his voice, projecting his hate-filled mockery across the room. The veterans in attendance, many of whom had witnessed Clark's career firsthand, stiffened in indignation. They had seen leaders in uniform show bravery in war zones, yet here was a law enforcement officer, daring to demean one of their own in a courtroom, the very place meant for justice. His smirk was enough to reveal his contempt. The words, laced with racial bias, were enough to spark outrage. The judge banged the gavel, attempting to regain control, but Mercer's performance had already made its mark. Clark's commanding presence filled the space, yet she didn't retaliate physically. She knew the power of patience and evidence. She understood that any hasty action could be misconstrued, but she also knew that her voice, her dignity, and her career's integrity would not be diminished by this blatant display of racism. The courtroom cameras caught every smirk, every taunt, and every dismissive gesture, ensuring the officer's misconduct was documented. Meanwhile, the gallery whispered in disbelief. Some veterans whispered to each other about filing formal complaints, while others simply shook their heads at the audacity. The daughter's wide eyes reflected both fear and a dawning understanding. This was the stark reality of bias, and it was happening right before her eyes. Clark placed her hand lightly on her daughter's shoulder, a silent reassurance that even in the face of blatant prejudice, strength and composure mattered most. Mercer, sensing no immediate retaliation, escalated further. He gestured broadly with his hands, emphasizing every mocking point, using exaggerated tones to ridicule her service. The words were not just verbal. The body language was layered with contempt, leaning, pointing, sneering, and asserting dominance in a space where respect was expected but denied. He was attempting to humiliate a decorated Black Army general in front of her peers, her subordinates, and the public. Each action was a deliberate act of intimidation, a performance of racist arrogance, and a gross abuse of his role. Clark's colleagues and other veterans began to murmur in disapproval. The room shifted in tension as they started documenting every move on phones and notepads. Even the judge, who had remained neutral until now, observed Mercer closely, a frown forming as the officer continued his display of biased aggression. Clark, however, remained immovable. Every inch of her posture screamed authority, courage, and discipline. Her uniform, the medals, and the calm in her eyes told a story of a lifetime spent in service. A story that Mercer, with all his mockery and prejudice, could not erase. By the time the bailiff stepped forward, attempting to defuse the situation, Mercer's smirking had already been captured, his extreme racism documented, and his audacity displayed in front of a courtroom filled with witnesses. The incident, though horrifying in its aggression, set the stage for Clark's strategic response. She would leverage her connections, use the documentation, and turn this humiliating encounter into a case study in accountability. Mercer's bias had been made visible, his actions undeniable, and the wheels of justice had just begun turning against him. The tension in the room lingered even after the judge called for a brief recess. The gallery slowly emptied, whispers and murmurs of outrage following them. Clark's daughter clung to her mother's side, learning an early lesson in dignity, resilience, and the confrontation of extreme racism. Outside the courtroom doors, the battle had only just begun. But for Mercer, the line had been crossed, and for Clark, justice and accountability were now within reach. Her composure, a silent but powerful weapon against prejudice. The courtroom had barely settled after the officer's first outburst when the tension ratcheted higher. Spectators shifted in their seats, some whispering nervously, others staring in disbelief as Officer Mercer continued to assert dominance with each step. Black Army General, mid-40s, wearing her decorated uniform with Star of Valor and medals gleaming, remained composed, her posture upright and unwavering. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, followed Mercer's every movement, reading the arrogance and blatant bias in his gestures. Her daughter, seated in the gallery, clutched her mother's hand tightly, eyes wide and filled with unease, watching the adult world navigate injustice in real time. Mercer, sensing no immediate pushback, raised his voice again, projecting his extreme racism through ridicule and intimidation. Stop. You think just because you wear that uniform you're untouchable? Step aside or learn your place. His tone was loud, filled with contempt and dripping with mockery. Every word was designed to humiliate, his posture leaning forward aggressively, chest puffed, fingers pointing as though asserting ownership over the courtroom space. The audience flinched at his audacity, some standing up slightly, ready to defend decency, while others discreetly recorded the spectacle on their phones. Despite the hostile energy, Clark did not flinch. She adjusted her notes with calm precision, keeping her voice steady as she addressed the judge. Your Honor, the behavior displayed here is not only unprofessional, but rooted in bias. I request formal documentation of these actions. Her words carried weight, the authority in her voice commanding attention. She knew that direct confrontation in this moment could backfire, but using procedure and documentation would be far more effective against Mercer's racist aggression. Mercer smirked, unfazed by her composure. He leaned closer, speaking just loud enough for those around him to hear, his mocking tone clear. Oh, we'll see if procedure protects you when someone decides you're out of line. Bet you've never been told to sit down before, have you? Each syllable dripped with condescension, extreme racism underscoring every gesture, every sneer. He deliberately used her gender and race to belittle her accomplishments, assuming intimidation alone could weaken her resolve. Veterans in the courtroom whispered to each other, eyes narrowing in anger. Many had trained with Clark, witnessed her heroic acts, and knew her reputation as a formidable leader. Their shock and outrage grew as Mercer's verbal attacks continued, seeing a decorated Black Army general publicly humiliated by someone who should have upheld the law. Some veterans subtly moved closer to the front benches, signaling silent support and readiness to challenge injustice if needed. Clark's daughter shifted in her seat, drawing her mother's attention. She gave a subtle nod, reassuring the child without breaking focus on Mercer. The young girl's small hand clutched her mother's firmly, a quiet testament to the courage she was learning to emulate. Clark's calm in the face of blatant racism and aggression demonstrated that real strength was measured not just in action, but in restraint, strategy, and the ability to fight bias with intelligence. As the judge tried to restore order, Mercer escalated further, now gesturing with both hands, shaking his finger at Clark as if he could physically push her down a notch in authority. Don't think your medals mean anything here, he barked, tone dripping with mockery. Some of us know how the real world works. The extreme racism was clear. It was in his words, his smirks, his posture, and the contempt he radiated. It wasn't subtle. It was an attempt to assert dominance over a Black woman in uniform, to publicly shame her and diminish her status. Clark, however, used every second strategically. She glanced at her phone discreetly, already signaling her legal team, preparing to make the Pentagon aware of this harassment. Her connection within the military was a powerful shield, and she intended to use it. Each smirk from Mercer was being recorded, cataloged, and would later serve as undeniable evidence of racial prejudice and professional misconduct. The spectators, now fully aware of the severity of Mercer's actions, reacted subtly, but firmly. Some veterans shook their heads, muttering in disbelief. A few bystanders whispered that they'd report the incident. The tension was thick, almost electric, as everyone realized this was no ordinary courtroom drama. It was a live demonstration of racism, power abuse, and institutional arrogance. By the time the judge called a short recess to calm the room, Clark remained composed, her daughter still tightly holding her hand. Mercer's arrogance lingered in the air, but so did the silent understanding among the audience that he had crossed a line. Clark's calm demeanor and the visible support from veterans and witnesses hinted that the officer's attempts to humiliate her would soon face severe consequences. The courtroom was more than a stage for intimidation. It was now a space where the courtroom remained charged with tension as the recess ended. Black Army General, mid-40s, wearing her full decorated uniform, stood calm yet commanding, a striking contrast to the simmering aggression of the white officer in navy blue. Officer Mercer strode back into the room, smirk still plastered across his face, assuming his intimidation had unsettled her. Instead, he found Clark scanning the courtroom, eyes sharp, calculating, every gesture composed. Her daughter, seated again in the gallery, clutched her mother's hand tightly, eyes wide, absorbing the sheer audacity of the officer's bias. Mercer wasted no time. He leaned over the front of the bench, gesturing with exaggerated arrogance, shouting, "You think you can just walk in here and be treated like everyone else? Sit down before someone teaches you what respect really is." His tone was dripping with extreme racism, his body language mocking, chest puffed, fingers pointed, and posture designed to humiliate. The courtroom fell silent, the sheer audacity leaving spectators stunned. The officer's words weren't just rude. They were a blatant display of contempt for her race, rank, and gender. Clark didn't flinch. Instead, she calmly opened her briefcase, retrieving documents and evidence of Mercer's prior complaints and misconduct. Every eye in the room tracked her movements, recognizing the quiet power she wielded. The veterans present stiffened, whispering to one another about the numerous times Mercer had crossed lines in the past, now fully visible to everyone. Clark's measured composure and methodical approach only intensified the humiliation for Mercer, whose smirk faltered slightly as he realized this wasn't going to be a one-sided confrontation. "Your Honor," Clark said clearly, projecting authority without aggression, "I have documented instances of this officer's prior misconduct. His behavior today continues a disturbing pattern of prejudice and abuse of power." Her words cut through the tension like a blade. Each phrase highlighted not just the racism she was enduring, but Mercer's systemic disregard for the rights and dignity of Black service members. The courtroom felt the weight of her experience, the authority of her rank, and the undeniable truth of her claims. Mercer, visibly frustrated, attempted to regain dominance. He leaned closer again, mocking through exaggerated gestures, raising his voice and repeating, "You're not untouchable. Think you can scare me with your fancy connections?" His body language screamed arrogance and hatred, the extreme racism of the moment, palpable. But Clark had anticipated this. Every sneer, every gesture was being recorded by both the courtroom cameras and spectators, ensuring that Mercer's misconduct would not go unnoticed. The daughter's small hand squeezed her mother's tighter, sensing both fear and the strength radiating from her. Clark glanced at her daughter with a reassuring nod, silently teaching courage in the face of blatant prejudice. She understood the significance of this moment, not just for her, but for every witness in that courtroom. Extreme racism was being challenged openly, and her presence as a Black Army general became a living rebuke to the officer's audacity. Veterans and courtroom observers began to murmur support quietly, some moving their phones to capture Mercer's actions. The whispers grew, a low hum of outrage and recognition, reinforcing Clark's position. She could feel the shift in energy. The attempt to humiliate her was failing, and the officer's extreme racism was now exposed to an audience who understood the stakes. Clark's strategy was precise. She addressed the judge again. "I request that all current and prior complaints against this officer be entered into evidence, demonstrating a consistent pattern of bias and misconduct. His attempts to intimidate me today only reaffirm the need for accountability." Her voice carried the authority of someone trained to lead under pressure, and it silenced Mercer, who realized that his performative aggression had been rendered ineffective. As the judge nodded, signaling for the documentation to be entered, Mercer's posture stiffened. He had relied on fear, intimidation, and racist mockery to control the room, but Clark's composed defiance and strategic action had turned the power dynamic completely. The courtroom's cameras, the witnesses, and even the murmuring veterans now bore witness to the officer's extreme racism, effectively neutralizing his attempts to humiliate a Black Army general. By the time the session broke for a brief lunch recess, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Clark remained a pillar of composure, her daughter by her side, learning early lessons in resilience, dignity, and the power of measured response against prejudice. Mercer's extreme racism had been fully exposed, and the path toward accountability was now firmly set in motion. The courtroom was thick with tension, the air almost vibrating with suppressed outrage. Black Army General, mid-40s, uniform spotless, medals glinting under the overhead lights, stood composed yet resolute. Officer Mercer, white, late 30s, dark navy uniform sharp and authoritative, prowled the space in front of her like a predator, smirking with extreme racial contempt. His smirk faltered slightly when he noticed the calm confidence in Clark's eyes, a quiet power that not even his intimidation could shake. Her daughter, seated in the gallery, held her mother's hand tightly, sensing the magnitude of the moment, yet drawing courage from her poise. Mercer leaned forward aggressively, arms crossed, sneering, and projecting his voice across the room. "You really think you can stand here and lecture me? You're just another loudmouth in a uniform. People like you shouldn't forget their place." Each word dripped with extreme racism, his body language amplifying the insult, chest puffed, finger jabbing in the air, leaning forward as if to dominate every inch of space. The courtroom murmured in disbelief, veterans exchanging glances that conveyed shared indignation at the blatant disrespect. Clark, however, remained unfazed. She reached discreetly for her phone, ensuring she could relay the incident immediately to her Pentagon contacts. Her calm actions masked the strategic calculation running through her mind. This wasn't just a personal affront. It was an opportunity to hold Mercer accountable through the proper channels, using his extreme racism and misconduct against him. She sent a coded message to her superior officers, knowing that the high-level response would be swift. The judge, sensing the growing tension, attempted to restore order, but Mercer ignored the subtle cues, continuing to taunt Clark. "You think your decorations mean anything here? I've seen plenty of people like you, loud, arrogant, thinking they're untouchable." The words were not just dismissive. They were laced with racial prejudice, intended to undermine her credibility and intimidate her in front of witnesses, family, and peers. Clark's daughter shifted slightly in her seat, anxiety visible in her posture, yet she looked to her mother for reassurance. Clark gave a subtle nod, a silent promise that she would protect both their dignity and their rights. Veterans and spectators leaned in, watching the unfolding scene, some pulling out phones to document the officer's actions, understanding that evidence was now building against him. Clark addressed the judge, her voice steady but firm. "Your Honor, I request that my communication with the Pentagon regarding this harassment be acknowledged. This officer's behavior demonstrates a clear pattern of racial bias and intimidation, which is relevant to the proceedings." Her words carried authority, backed by the weight of her rank and service. The judge nodded, making a note, Clearly impressed by Clark's measured response, Mercer's smirk twitched, frustration evident in his eyes. His plan to intimidate and humiliate a black army general in front of her peers and the public was unraveling. Every sneer, every gesture was being captured on camera, documented by witnesses, and noted by the judge. Clark's tactical patience and strategic use of her Pentagon connection had neutralized the immediate threat of humiliation and shifted the power dynamic. The courtroom was silent but charged with electricity as Clark's message reached her contacts. Within moments, a high-ranking official acknowledged the situation, signaling swift oversight and accountability measures. Mercer's extreme racism and abuse of power had just triggered consequences he could not control. Clark glanced at her daughter, who now sat a little taller, eyes wide with understanding. This was more than a courtroom lesson. It was a lesson in resilience, courage, and standing up against blatant prejudice. Mercer's attempts to demean her had failed, replaced instead by a carefully orchestrated response that ensured the officer's behavior would not go unchecked. By the time the session resumed, the atmosphere had shifted. Mercer's arrogance had faded slightly, replaced by cautious tension. Clark's strategy had set the tone for the rest of the proceedings, demonstrating that extreme racism would not go unchallenged, and that accountability could reach even those who thought they were untouchable. The courtroom now watched a black army general navigate and counteract extreme prejudice with precision, dignity, and authority. The courtroom had settled into an uneasy rhythm, the tension still heavy in the air. Black Army General, mid-40s, in her decorated uniform with gleaming Star of Valor and medals, stood resolute at the front, radiating calm authority. Her daughter, seated in the gallery, clutched her mother's hand tightly, eyes wide as the extreme racism from Officer Mercer continued to ripple through the room. Mercer, white, late 30s, dark navy uniform crisp, swaggering with arrogance, paced the space like he owned it, smirking and projecting every ounce of disdain he felt. He leaned forward aggressively toward Clark, voice rising, each word dripping with contempt. "You really think your medals make you special? People like you talk too much and don't belong in spaces like this," he said, gesturing with exaggerated motions, fingers pointing and chest puffed. Every movement underscored his extreme racism, a deliberate effort to intimidate and humiliate a black army general in front of her peers, subordinates, and her young daughter. But the spectators weren't silent. Veterans in the courtroom, some who had served alongside Clark in combat zones, began whispering amongst themselves, shaking their heads at the blatant abuse of authority. Their murmurs grew louder as Mrs. Thompson, a retired colonel, stood from the audience, voice steady yet forceful. "I witnessed Officer Mercer's behavior firsthand. His actions today are a disgrace and a clear display of racial bias." Her words carried weight, resonating through the courtroom and sending a ripple of support toward Clark. Clark's daughter's grip on her mother's hand loosened slightly, sensing the shift. The young girl saw courage mirrored in others, understanding that standing against extreme racism required both strength and the willingness to speak up. Clark nodded subtly at the witnesses, silently encouraging them to continue, knowing their testimonies were critical in reinforcing the officer's misconduct. Mercer's smirk faltered momentarily as more voices rose. A veteran seated in the gallery stood, adding, "I've served with General Clark. Her character and competence are beyond question. Your attempts to demean her are purely rooted in prejudice." Every word, every gaze of support toward Clark chipped away at Mercer's performative arrogance. The extreme racism he displayed was no longer unchecked. It was being countered openly, visibly, and with undeniable authority. Clark addressed the judge again, maintaining her composure. "Your Honor, I request that these witness statements be officially noted. This officer's conduct demonstrates a consistent pattern of discrimination and intimidation that cannot be ignored." Her calm, yet commanding voice held the room's attention, emphasizing the contrast between her measured authority and Mercer's aggressive posturing. The judge, recognizing the weight of these statements and the extreme racism clearly on display, nodded and instructed the courtroom clerk to document the testimonies formally. Each witness further exposed Mercer's bias, detailing both his words and body language, painting a vivid picture of an officer who had misused his authority to humiliate a Black Army general publicly. Clark's daughter, now sitting a little taller, watched as the adults around her called out injustice. This was more than a lesson in courage. It was a masterclass in dignity under pressure, in standing firm despite extreme racism. Clark's presence, unwavering poise, and careful orchestration of support ensured that the officer's behavior could not be dismissed or minimized. By the end of Part 5, Mercer's extreme racism had been fully documented. Witnesses had spoken up. The courtroom cameras captured every smirk, gesture, and mocking remark, and the atmosphere had shifted decisively. The audience understood that his attempts at intimidation were failing. Clark's strategy of combining patience, authority, and support from credible witnesses had begun dismantling his facade of power, making it clear that accountability was inevitable. The courtroom air was heavy, a mix of tension and quiet anticipation. Black Army General, mid-40s, in full decorated uniform with Star of Valor and medals gleaming, stood at the front with calm authority. Her daughter, sitting in the gallery, clutched her mother's hand tightly, eyes wide, absorbing every moment of the unfolding drama. Officer Mercer, white, late 30s, dark navy uniform crisp, had begun the session with his usual arrogance, projecting extreme racism through smirks, gestures, and mocking tones, but that facade was now cracking. As the judge instructed the next witness to speak, Mercer's fingers twitched and his jaw tightened. He leaned forward, attempting to reassert control, voice raised. "You all think you can gang up on me? I've got authority here." His posture screamed defiance, but it lacked the conviction it had earlier. Extreme racism radiated from his every word, a desperate attempt to intimidate Clark and the courtroom, yet it now appeared performative and hollow. Clark remained composed, voice calm, eyes unwavering. She addressed the judge and the courtroom without flinching. "Your Honor, the continuous harassment and discriminatory behavior of Officer Mercer cannot be overlooked. These actions demonstrate a pattern of racial prejudice and professional misconduct." Her words carried authority, resonating in a room now attuned to the seriousness of the officer's extreme racism. Witness after witness detailed Mercer's past behavior, instances of bias, verbal mockery, and public intimidation. Each account chipped away at his credibility. Veterans nodded in support, some quietly recording the proceedings, ensuring every infraction was documented. Mercer shifted uncomfortably, realizing that his extreme racism and attempts to humiliate Clark had now turned into evidence against him. Clark's daughter watched her mother with awe, seeing firsthand how to handle aggression with dignity and strategy. The young girl squeezed her mother's hand, understanding courage in action. Clark glanced at her, offering a reassuring nod, a silent promise that she would protect both of them while confronting injustice. As the judge called for a brief recess, Mercer's body language betrayed stress. The smirk was gone, replaced by a tense jaw and narrowed eyes. Extreme racism, once wielded like a weapon to intimidate, had been neutralized by careful documentation, witness testimonies, and Clark's strategic poise. Each gesture, word, and smirk from him was now a liability, meticulously recorded for accountability. Clark quietly communicated with her legal team, ensuring Pentagon oversight would remain informed. Every step Mercer had taken to assert dominance had been countered with procedure, support, and strategy. The courtroom's energy had shifted. What began as extreme racism aimed at humiliation had become a showcase of accountability and the power of measured resistance. By the time the session resumed, Mercer's aggression had visibly waned. He moved stiffly, aware that every action was under scrutiny. Clark stood firm, exuding calm authority, while her daughter observed courage, resilience, and justice in real time. The extreme racism that Mercer had tried to leverage as a weapon was now the very reason his credibility and career were at risk. The courtroom was now electric with tension, every observer aware of the weight of what was unfolding. Black Army General, mid-40s, in her full decorated uniform, stood at the front, calm and resolute. Her star of valor glinted under the bright lights, medals perfectly aligned, a visual testament to her career and dedication. Her daughter, seated in the gallery, clutched her mother's hand tightly, wide-eyed, absorbing the scene as history quietly unfolded before her. Officer Mercer, white, late 30s, dark navy uniform, was now visibly strained. The extreme racism he had wielded so boldly in the past sessions had become a source of exposure, his every move scrutinized and recorded. Mercer attempted to regain composure, pacing like a caged animal, voice rising as he barked, "You think your rank gives you all the power? You're just another loudmouth trying to lecture the system." His gestures were exaggerated, chest thrust forward, fingers pointed aggressively, and his posture radiated forced authority. His extreme racism was evident in the contemptuous tone he used when referring to Clark, clearly attempting to humiliate her in front of witnesses, peers, and the public. But the more he tried, the weaker his performance appeared. The courtroom had seen through his facade. Clark, unwavering, addressed the judge with precision and authority. "Your Honor, the officer's behavior today is a blatant display of racial prejudice and abuse of power. This is not just about this courtroom. It reflects a systemic issue that must be addressed." Her voice carried conviction and authority, every word resonating with the weight of truth. Veterans and spectators nodded in agreement, understanding that the extreme racism on display was being documented meticulously. Witnesses were called one by one. Each account amplified the exposure of Mercer's bias. A former colleague, a veteran witness, and even staff who had observed his previous misconduct all testified. Every detail of his harassment and extreme racism toward black service members was laid bare. Mercer's attempts to interrupt, deflect, or intimidate were met with sharp corrections from the judge and the stern presence of Clark. Clark's daughter, observing the bravery and composure of both her mother and the witnesses, grew more confident in her grip on her mother's hand. She was absorbing a lesson in resilience, witnessing firsthand how to confront systemic prejudice with dignity and strategy. Clark's subtle glances reassured her, reinforcing that courage was often quiet but powerful. As Clark prepared her closing remarks for the session, she ensured that all Pentagon oversight had received full documentation. Every insult, gesture, and threat of intimidation from Mercer had been recorded, backed by credible witnesses and cross-verified. This careful collection of evidence transformed extreme racism from a weapon intended to humiliate into a tool of accountability that would ultimately dismantle Mercer's authority. Mercer's body language betrayed his growing awareness of the situation. His smirk had faded entirely, replaced by tight lips and anxious glances toward the judge. He realized the power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. Clark's calm authority, the weight of her credentials, and the meticulous documentation of his extreme racism had cornered him professionally and socially. By the session's end, it was clear to everyone present, extreme racism, once used as a tool for intimidation, had become Mercer's undoing. Clark had not only defended her dignity, but also ensured that the system itself would recognize and act against his misconduct. Veterans whispered to one another, spectators shifted in their seats, and Clark's daughter sat taller, having witnessed courage, strategy, and justice unfold before her eyes. The courtroom was thick with anticipation, every person present sensing that the tide had turned irrevocably. Black Army general, mid-40s, her uniform immaculate, medals shining under the fluorescent lights, stood with the quiet authority of someone who had faced adversity countless times before. Her daughter, sitting close by, clutched her hand, eyes wide with both fear and admiration, absorbing the gravity of what was happening. Officer Mercer, white, late 30s, dark navy uniform, crisp and precise, paced uneasily. His confidence, once bolstered by extreme racism and arrogance, was visibly cracking. Every sneer and mocking gesture he had used against Clark earlier now looked hollow, ineffective in the face of overwhelming evidence. Mercer attempted a final show of dominance, leaning aggressively toward Clark with a raised voice. "You think you can humiliate me in front of this courtroom? You're just a soldier trying to play hero." His gestures were exaggerated, chest puffed, fingers jabbing, and his tone dripping with contempt. A textbook display of extreme racism aimed at undermining her credibility and intimidating everyone in the room. But this time, the courtroom did not flinch. Clark's composure, combined with meticulously documented evidence and witness testimonies, rendered his aggression powerless. The extreme racism he relied upon for control now only highlighted his unprofessionalism and bias. Clark calmly addressed the judge, her voice steady and commanding. "Your Honor, this officer's actions today and throughout his career demonstrate a consistent pattern of racial prejudice, intimidation, and abuse of authority. This is not a single incident." Each word carried weight, reflecting both her authority as a decorated Army general and her deep commitment to justice. Veterans and courtroom spectators leaned forward, hanging on every syllable, recognizing the significance of the moment. Witnesses continued to speak up, recounting specific incidents where Mercer had abused his position, using extreme racism as a tool for intimidation. The courtroom cameras captured every detail: smirks, jabs, mocking tones, and gesturing. Each observation added to a growing mountain of evidence, a comprehensive portrayal of the officer's misconduct. The presence of Clark's daughter made the scene even more poignant. She witnessed firsthand the bravery required to confront and overcome blatant racial prejudice. Clark's Pentagon contacts had been continuously updated, and high-ranking officials were now monitoring the proceedings in real time. The message was clear. Extreme racism would no longer be tolerated, and any officer attempting to leverage bias for intimidation or humiliation would face severe consequences. Mercer's attempts to belittle Clark and her daughter had not only failed, but had triggered a mechanism of accountability that he could not evade. As the final testimonies concluded, Mercer's body language betrayed his growing realization of the consequences. His posture stiffened, jaw tight, eyes darting nervously. The extreme racism that had fueled his arrogance now marked him as the central figure of scrutiny. Clark's unshakable calm, her methodical strategy, and the sheer weight of evidence had neutralized every attempt he had made to dominate the courtroom. The judge, after reviewing the evidence and testimonies, acknowledged the severity of the officer's actions. Officer Mercer's conduct, as documented and corroborated by multiple witnesses, demonstrates clear racial prejudice and abuse of authority. Measures will be taken immediately to ensure accountability and prevent further misconduct. The words hung in the room, a powerful declaration that the system recognized the injustice and was prepared to act decisively. Clark exhaled slowly, glancing at her daughter with a reassuring smile. The girl's eyes shone with a mix of relief and pride, having witnessed her mother confront extreme racism with courage, precision, and unwavering dignity. Veterans in the courtroom applauded quietly, their nods and murmurs of approval reinforcing the significance of what had just occurred. Officer Mercer was escorted out, the extreme racism he had relied upon now fully exposed. His career, once seemingly secure, faced immediate jeopardy. Clark had turned a moment of personal attack into a masterclass of accountability, ensuring that prejudice, no matter how extreme, could not override justice. The courtroom, the Pentagon, and the public were all witnesses to a powerful lesson. Courage, strategy, and integrity could dismantle even the most brazen displays of racism. By the end of the day, the atmosphere had shifted from tension and fear to a tangible sense of justice and resolution. Clark had protected her dignity, educated her daughter in real time, and ensured that an officer who attempted to weaponize extreme racism faced immediate and undeniable consequences. The fallout was clear. Abuse of power and racial prejudice would no longer go unchecked, and the courage to stand firm against such acts had made history that day.